It's been shared with courtrooms around the country, but not seen by the public.
It has been 3 years since a violent mob attacked our capital. Much work has been done to hold members of the mob responsible for the crimes they committed. The prosecutions have necessarily focused on the actions of the individuals charged, not the collective harm done by the thousands of people who were simultaneously committing crimes that day. It is critical, though, that we remember the collective harm that was done on January 6, 2021, and understand how it happened so that we can ensure it never happens again. Also, on the occasion of this anniversary, we request the public's continued assistance in identifying individuals who committed crimes on January 6, 2021, who have yet to be identified, particularly the roughly 80 still unidentified individuals who were believed to have committed acts of violence against law enforcement officers. In furtherance of bringing these people to justice, we will be highlighting some of the most serious assaults that have yet to be charged and providing photographs of the unidentified suspects that the FBI has prepared. Before turning to what remains to be done, though, let's start with the events of January 6, 2021, and the collective harm that was done that day. The evidence admitted in court, a fraction of which is highlighted in this presentation, provides a comprehensive picture of the day's harrowing events. On January 6, 2021, the United States lost control of the grounds around its capital and most of the capital itself. Thousands of people descended on the Capitol, and hundreds of people within the mob used force and violence to overwhelm the vastly outnumbered law enforcement officers protecting the building and those who work within it. In scenes often reminiscent of a medieval battle, officers engaged in hand-to-hand combat with members of this invading force, many of whom carried dangerous weapons, including firearms, chemical sprays, tasers, stabbing weapons, and makeshift weapons across the Capitol grounds and in the Capitol itself. 140 officers guarding the Capitol that day reported physical injury. But we know from talking to the hundreds of officers guarding the Capitol that day that this 140 number undercounts the number of officers who were physically injured, let alone those who have suffered trauma as a result of the day's events. The siege of the Capitol is likely the largest single-day mass assault of law enforcement officers in our nation's history. A number of law enforcement officers who were injured have left their prior positions or are, to this day, physically unable to continue to serve the police community. With nearly 900 people convicted to date of crimes committed on January 6, 2021, we are at a point in our prosecutions where thousands of photographs, videos, and communications have been accepted by courts. We want to share with you some of the evidence so you have an understanding of the crimes that occurred on January 6, 2021. Before getting into the specifics, though, when you have spent as much time as we have spent reviewing evidence, you are drawn to the big picture. What the events of January 6, 2021 reveal is that our democracy is fragile. The fact that we have existed with peaceful transitions of power for over 200 years is not a guarantee of our future. Nothing is assured. The individual rights we all hold so dear are only protected as long as our democracy continues to exist, and we remain a nation committed to upholding the rule of law and peaceful transitions of power after each free and fair election. We must remain vigilant in pursuing justice without fear or favor and holding those accountable who threaten our sacred institutions and refuse to adhere to the laws in this country. That is the why of these prosecutions, and it is why we continue to pursue this mission without fear or favor, and it is why we continue to seek the assistance of the American people. January 6, 2021 was not a date selected at random. It was a date of particular significance to our democracy. The Constitution directs each state to select electors who will vote for the president and empowers Congress to select the day and time that these electors will report their votes. Congress, in turn, passed a law setting each January 6th after a presidential election as the date when it will receive the votes of the electors, and specifically identified 1 p.m. as the hour on January 6th when the votes are to be received. In our modern elections, these electors, almost without fail, vote for the candidate who won the popular vote in their respective states. This constitutional provision and the laws passed in support of the provision enshrine a principle dating back to the founding of our country, the peaceful transfer of power. For over 200 years prior to January 6, 2021, our country has routinely and peacefully held this solemn vote, formalizing the results of the election, no matter how hotly contested the election was, and we have had no shortage of fiercely contested elections in our nation's history. In late 2020, many of the people disappointed with the results of the 2020 presidential election were aware of this constitutionally required proceeding on January 6, 2021, and some began setting about to stop it. The story of the siege of the Capitol on January 6 began in the days and the weeks following the election, when a number of our fellow citizens were radicalized into believing that they needed to use any means necessary, including force and violence, to stop Joseph R. Biden Jr. from becoming president. One of these groups was the Proud Boys, a group that describes itself as a, quote, pro-Western fraternal organization for men who refuse to apologize for creating the modern world, aka Western chauvinists, unquote. Some of the rallies and protests that Proud Boys have attended have resulted in violence involving members of the group. Within a few days of the 2020 presidential election, it became clear that Joe Biden had won the election and was this country's president-elect. As the press began reporting this fact, senior leaders of the Proud Boys took to social media and called for resisting the outcome. The then national chairman of the organization, Enrique Tarrio, bluntly and ominously warned on social media, if Biden steals this election, the Proud Boys will be political prisoners. We won't go quietly, I promise. In late December 2020, Tarrio and a number of other leaders within the Proud Boys organization formed a special chapter of the Proud Boys that was full of so-called rally boys who agreed to follow the commands of leadership. Tarrio handpicked a leadership team for the group and tasked the leadership team with recruiting trusted men who were prepared to travel. The first and only event for which they planned was the certification of the Electoral College proceeding on January 6, 2021 in D.C. The leadership team successfully recruited nearly 100 Proud Boys for the effort, helped to coordinate certain recruits' travel, and raised money to purchase paramilitary gear and supplies, including tactical vests, protective equipment, and radio equipment. After successfully recruiting and organizing these hand-picked Proud Boys, Tarrio posted on New Year's Day 2021 messages on social media that read, quote, let's bring this new year with one word in mind, revolt, and later, quote, New Year's Revolution, and Lords of War J6, J20. In private encrypted message groups created for members of the special chapter, its members openly discuss storming the Capitol and other assaults on law enforcement officers. The hand-selected men of the special chapter were directed to meet near the Washington Monument at 10 a.m. on January 6th. On the morning of January 6, 2021, a group of approximately 100 Proud Boys members gathered near the Washington Monument. There was a First Amendment protected rally at the ellipse of the White House, where speakers were slated to address the same grievances that the Proud Boys leaders had with the 2020 presidential election. We have First Amendment protected rallies in the district on almost a daily basis, and almost all of them, are peaceful rallies like the one that occurred at the ellipse that day. The Proud Boys did not go to the ellipse. Instead, around 10:30 a.m., the leadership of this January 6 Proud Boys chapter marched away from the planned speeches. They marched to the Capitol, riling themselves and others up along the way.
And I refuse to apologize. And I refuse to apologize. not a word.
Cries of 1776 could be heard throughout the day on January 6, 2021. 1776 is, of course, the year our founding fathers declared their independence from their sovereign, the King of England. On January 6, 2021, it was used as shorthand for revolution, this time against a government formed under the democratic system created by the founding fathers. Once they arrived at the Capitol, they walked around it, giving them an opportunity to probe its defenses. The march revealed that the grounds surrounding the Capitol had been blocked off with bike racks and snow fencing, and that these bike racks and fences had signs on them warning the general public that they were not allowed to enter. The grounds were restricted because of the certification proceeding that was to take place that day, and the people who would be on the grounds for it, including the then Vice President. The outer perimeter formed by these racks and fences is called the restricted perimeter. One of the areas the Proud Boys passed as they marched around the Capitol was the Peace Circle. What they saw when they passed shortly after 11:20 a.m. was a single officer guarding this major entry point to the Capitol grounds. As they passed, the Proud Boys rallied their men, again invoking 1776.
You have to notice, real men are here. We know, though, that toward the Constitution, the United States against foreign enemies and domestic. Let us remind those who have forgotten what that means. Thank our mere presence is already
The Proud Boys did not stop when they saw this minimally guarded entrance point. Instead, they continued to march around the Capitol. The Proud Boys returned to the Peace Circle at 12:50 p.m., minutes before the certification proceeding was scheduled to start. Consistent with their discussions in private encrypted messages, they riled up the small crowd gathered near the Capitol, normies, as they called them, and used them as force multipliers to overpower the hopelessly outnumbered officers guarding the Capitol and the people who worked there. Days after the attack, a member of the Proud Boys leadership, Joe Biggs, brazenly explained the plan on a podcast, bragging that when the number of people trying to take a building dramatically outnumber the people protecting it, the building will be taken. Law enforcement found this recording in a file entitled Civil War on a device belonging to Mr. Biggs.
When you're holding a position like a fort and you're being overrun, if there's 3 of you or 4 of you and you're outnumbered 100 to 1, are you going to sit there and just go, I'm holding the door? No, you're just going to get your ass beat. That's already gone. If that many people show up to your house, there's nothing you can do about it.
The straightforward plan was made all the more likely to succeed by 2 events that occurred around the time that the Proud Boys walked back toward the Peace Circle. Explosive devices were found outside the DNC's and RNC's headquarters, and there were what turned out to be false reports of an explosion at the Capitol South Metro Station. Capitol Police officers responded to these other locations, further depleting the already too few officers outside the Capitol. Moments before the Proud Boys arrived at the Peace Circle, this is what the crowd just outside the restricted area looked like. This was mere minutes before the certification was scheduled to start. These people were just milling about and not making any effort to illegally enter the restricted area before the Proud Boys harnessed the anger that was swirling around the crowd amassed outside the Capitol. Within moments of arriving at the Peace Circle, the Proud Boys were able to amplify and channel that rage.
Who's Capitol? Who's Capitol?
Despite being newly formed and relatively few in number, the mob quickly and brutally overwhelmed the dozen or so officers guarding this first fence line. The joint session of Congress was gaveling into order around the time of this breach. After overpowering this line, the mob was able to quickly surge past the unguarded second fence line on the Pennsylvania walkway before the officers could rally to its protection. When officers regrouped and formed a new police line closer to the Capitol, leaders of the Proud Boys tore down a metal fence and unleashed the crowd to advance further toward the Capitol. With these barriers breached on the west lawn, the mob was able to gain access to the base of the Capitol, where a temporary structure had been built to host the inauguration that was set to take place in just 2 weeks' time. The mob began assaulting the officers, desperately trying to maintain control of the plaza. The evidence we have introduced at trials includes the radio transmissions of the officers protecting the Capitol. As an officer saw the assaults, he frantically called for non-lethal weapons to try to stop assaults of him and his fellow officers.
Unit 6, I got a crowd fighting with officers pushing guard projectiles. I have given warnings about chemical munitions. I need to let the lethal team position above me to identify the agitators and start deploying. Launch, launch, launch!
With the clear path opened by the Proud Boys to this area, a sea of humanity was able to amass at the place where the peaceful transfer of power was set to occur. January 6th, 2021 was a cold, windy day, as so many January days are in the District of Columbia. The flags members of the mob carried blew in the wind. The scene looked like a medieval advancing horde marching under banner. Here, the mob's progress was briefly stalled. The police, who had fallen back, were able to regroup, and reinforcements from the Metropolitan Police Department arrived. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they stopped the mob's advance. This stalemate continued for roughly an hour as the mob continued to balloon in size, with many from the now completed rally at the Ellipse joining the fray. Proud Boys, though, ensured that the law enforcement's success was short-lived. After several of its leaders had regrouped away from the police line, key leaders of the Proud Boys again moved forward and reassembled at the base of a concrete set of stairs that was guarded by groups of officers vastly outnumbered by the crowd. A Proud Boys member at the front initiated the push, and other Proud Boys and members of the crowd surged forward behind them as the mob advanced up the stairs toward the window and doors that provided access to the Capitol building itself. As is evidenced by the number of members of the mob who flashed the Proud Boys hand sign when this breach occurred, this breach was a Proud Boys operation through and through. I would note that the evidence I am sharing today is among the substantial amount of evidence admitted in courts against individuals affiliated with the Proud Boys who were charged with crimes related to January 6, 2021. To date, dozens of these Proud Boys have been convicted, including Tario, Biggs, and 2 others who were convicted of a host of charges, including seditious conspiracy. Let's pause for a moment and talk about the weapons that the crowd possessed and the weapons that they used on January 6, 2021. We will never know all the weapons that were on the Capitol grounds that day because very few in the mob were actually arrested on January 6th. There was not enough law enforcement to defend the Capitol and the people in it, let alone to arrest the thousands of people who illegally entered Capitol grounds. In those limited incidents where the police did briefly detain someone, they quickly realized that the situation was so dangerous that they could not safely process the arrest and often had to let the person they detained go. And sometimes these people rejoined the advancing mob. Despite the fact that almost none of the members of the mob were searched on January 6, 2021, we have, through thorough investigation, established beyond a reasonable doubt that scores of those present were armed. The evidence has established the following weapons were present at the Capitol on the grounds: firearms, OC spray, tasers, edged weapons, including a sword, axes, hatchets, and knives, makeshift weapons, including destroyed office furniture, baseball bats, a hockey stick, flagpoles, and knuckle gloves. And finally, police equipment, some of which they stole from officers, others they brought with them because they were law enforcement officers themselves. With the exception of the firearms, members of the mob used or brandished each of these kinds of weapons that day, maybe none more so than the OC spray, commonly referred to as pepper spray. These are sprays designed to irritate a person's eyes and breathing passage so much that it disables them. And some members of the mob even used more powerful formulations of the spray that was intended for use against bears. I mentioned that January 6th was windy. These winds shifted throughout the day. As the mob sprayed officers with chemicals, and the officers deployed pepper spray to try to stop the mob's violence, the volume of spray in the air and the shifting winds ensured that most officers who spent time on the front line were exposed to this terrible spray. Returning to the mob's siege of the Capitol, it is important to note that the mob also breached the perimeter on the east side of the Capitol. With this breach, the mob began encircling the officers protecting the Capitol. With thousands of people illegally amassed on Capitol grounds, the building would soon fall. A group on the west side of the Capitol, including members of the Proud Boys, charged at officers, creating a hole in the police line guarding the staircase to the Upper West Terrace, which leads to the first floor of the Capitol. Once there, the mob made its way to a door near the Senate chamber. A member of the Proud Boys once again played a pivotal role. Proud Boy Dominic Pizzola had stolen a riot shield from a Capitol Police officer whom he had assaulted earlier that day. Pizzola advanced up the stairs with the shield and used the shield to break a window near the Senate door at 2:13 p.m. Members of the mob climbed through the shattered window panes, opened the door, and other members of the mob flooded in. Pizzola celebrated with a selfie-style video recorded from inside the Capitol, with what he called a victory smoke.
Victory smoke in the Capitol, boys. This is fucking awesome. I knew we could take this motherfucker over. Just tried hard enough. Proud of you, motherfucking boy.
This breach by the mob, the first of many on that day, was the first time since the War of 1812 that an invading force had defied the United States and broken into its capital.
They called on it. They built it.
Okay, the Capitol was in breach.
Okay.
By the time this first breach occurred, the Senate and House of Representatives had ended their joint session and were each in session in their respective chambers. Almost immediately after the breach occurred, the Senate suspended its proceedings, and the Vice President was quickly evacuated from the Senate. The advancing mob came in within feet of the Vice President as he evacuated, and the heroic efforts by law enforcement prevented a further catastrophe. The House continued into session until approximately 2:30. As I will explain shortly, the additional time the House remained in session would prove critical to the day's events. The breach of the Senate wing door was not the only time the Capitol was breached that day. 8 other locations were breached. We provide examples of just 3 of these breaches. The East Portico window, the upper house door, and the north door. The most notorious of the other breaches is the breach of the East Rotunda. It began at around 2 p.m. when rioters, having received news of the mob's attack on the West Front, broke through the barricades and pushed the line of police officers up the steps and then all the way to the Rotunda doors, where they surrounded and attacked the police, ultimately breaching the doors with the assistance of rioters already inside the building who opened the doors, effectively outflanking the officers. After a first wave of rioters flooded in, the police managed to shut the doors, only to have them breached for a second time. The breaches of the Rotunda door were notorious not just because of the number of rioters who were able to enter as a result, but because they are associated with one of the most infamous scenes from January 6, 2021. A stack of individuals marching in military formation up the stairs on the east side of the Capitol before entering the Rotunda doors. They were part of an organization called the Oath Keepers. The Oath Keepers explicitly focused on recruiting current and former military law enforcement and first responder personnel to their ranks. The organization's name alludes to the oaths sworn by members of the military and police to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. On their website, the Oath Keepers declare that they will not obey unconstitutional orders. Their leader, Stuart Rhodes, was the arbiter of what was and was not constitutional. And he and his followers had firmly adopted the false claim that it would be unconstitutional for President-elect Biden to be sworn in as president. In the months between the 2020 presidential election and January 6, 2021, Rhodes and other Oath Keepers began planning to stop the lawful transition of presidential power. The messages from Rhodes became more dire as January 6 approached. In late December, Rhodes stated that if President-elect Biden were able to assume the presidency, we will, quote, we will have to do a bloody, massively bloody revolution against them. That's what's going to happen. He urged President Trump to use military force to stop the lawful transfer of presidential power, describing January 6 as, quote, a hard constitutional deadline, unquote, to do so. In reference to the congressional proceeding that was supposed to occur on January 6, he wrote, quote, I think Congress will screw him, in reference to President Trump, over. The only chance he has is if we scare the shit out of them and convince them that it will be torches and pitchforks time if they don't do the right thing. But I don't think they will listen. Rhodes ominously warned that if Congress and Trump fail to act, then we will. Rhodes organized a force that could do just that, arranging for roughly 24 Oath Keepers to be in the D.C. area on January 6, 2021, and for a stockpile of weapons to be brought to the area as well. A witness who saw this arsenal of weapons testified at Rhodes' trial that he, quote, had not seen that many weapons in one location since he was in the military, unquote. Most of Rhodes' forces deployed to D.C. on the morning of January 6. A small number remained at a hotel in Virginia with the arsenal of firearms the group brought, waiting for the order from their leader, Rhodes, to bring the firearms to the district. Ultimately, the Oath Keepers did not need firearms to breach the Capitol. As Rhodes watched the chaos unfold on Capitol grounds and saw the mob advancing on the Capitol itself, he wrote to his followers, hey, the founding generation stormed the governor's mansion in Massachusetts and tarred and feathered his tax collectors, and they seized and dumped tea and water. They didn't fire on them, but they street fought. That's where we are now. Next comes our Lexington. It's coming. Rhodes rallied his followers to the Capitol grounds as the building started to be breached. The first of his followers to arrive formed the stack and marched on the still closed East Rotunda doors. Shortly after the stack made it to the door, it was breached. Other Oath Keepers made it to the Capitol to join the thousands of others who unlawfully entered the unprotected building. As Rhodes watched the fruits of his handiwork, one of his fellow Oath Keepers observed how terrified the members of Congress inside the building must be.
They gotta be shooting their pants inside there now. What's that? They gotta be shooting their pants inside. Amen. They need to ship their fucking pants. 6 separate Tyrannos.
Rhodes' response there? Sic semper tyrannis. This is Latin for thus always with tyrants. And these were the words of John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated President Lincoln as he jumped out of the presidential box. Rhodes' ambitions did not stop with thwarting the certification on January 6, 2021. Indeed, he admitted when he was cross-examined at trial that he intended to use force to oppose the government if President-elect Biden was sworn into office. These are the kinds of conspiracies that made the spark in the crowd on January 6, 2021 spread like wildfire. Again, the evidence I am sharing today is among the substantial amount of evidence admitted in courts against individuals affiliated with the Oath Keepers who were charged with crimes related to January 6, 2021. To date, over 20 Oath Keepers have been convicted, including Rhodes, who was convicted of a host of charges, including seditious conspiracy. Before returning to the events of the day and what happened inside of the building, an important note when it comes to our prosecutions about those who remained outside the building. We have used our prosecutorial discretion to primarily focus on those who entered the building or those who engaged in violent or corrupt conduct on Capitol grounds. But if a person knowingly entered the restricted area without authorization, they had already committed a federal crime. Make no mistake, thousands of people occupied an area that they were not authorized to be present in the first place. Once the mob was inside the building, it flowed to both the Senate wing of the building and the House of Representatives wing of the building. Some used staircases in the Senate wing to get access to the second floor of the building, which is where the main entrance of the Senate is located. While the former vice president had been quickly evacuated shortly after the initial breach, the evacuation of the senators moved at a slightly slower pace, and the mob was moving quickly enough through the Senate wing that it could have come face to face with senators who were fleeing the Senate floor. Fortunately, Officer Eugene Goodman stood between the tip of the mob and the evacuating senators. His well-documented actions that day were critical in providing enough time for the Senate to be completely evacuated. The senators were successfully removed from the chambers before the mob could trap them. Other members of the mob, though, went to the stairs found in a room in the center of the first floor of the building called the crypt. As you can see, the mob was able to make quick work of the few officers trying to form a line protecting the crypt. From the stairs in the crypt, the crowd reached the centerpiece of the Capitol, the iconic rotunda. There, those who entered from the west side of the building ultimately joined with those who entered from the east side of the building. The few officers who were in the rotunda had no chance at controlling the mob that had descended on them. Some members of the mob who passed through the rotunda headed from the rotunda in the direction of the Senate, joining the members of the mob who had climbed the stairs that were closer to the Senate wing door. The evacuation of the Senate left the Senate floor unguarded. Like an invading army, members of the mob streamed into the home of what has been recognized as the world's greatest deliberative body and took control, rifling through the papers of senators, disrespecting the desks where former presidents and other lions of our nation sat when they served in the Senate, and taking control of the Senate dais where the vice president had earlier been presiding. Events were even graver in the House of Representatives. Before turning to those events, a word about the venom that was in the air that day. Numerous members of the mob had cried out for lawmakers to be turned over to them, regardless of political party or affiliation. Their collective cries sounding like those of a lynch mob seeking to impart their own perverted vision of justice. The two lawmakers whose names were shouted the most were the then Vice President, Mike Pence, and the then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
I say we should have been doing this a long fucking time ago. Them worthless fucking shitholes like fucking Jerry Nadler, fucking Pelosi, Clapper, Comey, fucking all those pieces of garbage. You know, Obama, all these dudes, Clinton, fuck all these pieces of shit. That's what they need. They don't need a jail cell. They need to hang from these motherfuckers while everybody videotapes it and fucking spreads it on YouTube. Pence caved. I'm telling you, if Pence caved, we're gonna drag motherfuckers through the streets. You fucking politicians are gonna get fucking drugged through the streets. Yeah. Because we're not gonna have our fucking shit stolen. We're not gonna have our election, our country stolen. If we find out you politicians voted for it, we're gonna drag your fucking ass through the street. Because it's the second fucking revolution.
Since 1817, that Capitol was stormed and taken. They had to run congressmen and senators out of the Capitol with black bags over their heads. Black bags. Why black bags? Black bags because the crowd is so irate, we probably would have murdered a few of them.
Fortunately, we will never know if this member of the mob is correct about what would have happened had the mob inside the Capitol captured a lawmaker. But scenes like the ones we just saw strongly support his belief. A substantial portion of the mob marched on the House of Representatives. They encountered a line of officers in a hallway leading toward the chamber. Led by a rioter wielding a flagpole as a weapon, they surged forward, pushed the officers back into a narrow vestibule leading to the House chamber doors, and the officers eventually had to escape from the door.
It's too late for that. They don't listen without that stuff.
Officers inside the chamber barricaded the door and, along with a member of Congress, stood guard, confronting the mob just on the other side. The door was so secure that the mob could not breach it. Apparently frustrated by their inability to gain access, several members of the mob broke off and looked for an alternative entrance. They found one, the Speaker's entrance to the House of Representatives. They found that the hallway doors leading to this entrance were also lightly guarded, with just a few officers standing watch. Just to recap all the mob had collectively done to get to this point. On Capitol grounds, they had broken no fewer than a dozen fence lines or lines of officers meant to prevent illegal access, taking control of the grounds around the Capitol. They had by force broken into no fewer than 9 entry points at the Capitol. They had broken lines in the crypt, the rotunda, and elsewhere within the building, and temporarily wrested control over most of the building from the United States. The situation escalated quickly as the ever-growing mob watched members of Congress evacuate the chamber and demanded that the officers step aside. One particularly violent member of the mob bashed the windows of the swinging door with his fists. This was a scene around this time inside the House of the Representatives.
We have units on the third floor of the House chamber. 4:15 a.m. That is affirmative. We have units on the third floor inside the gallery, along with about 12 to 15 members of Congress and staff.
Eventually, the officers guarding the glass door that we just saw had to give way. Having taken control of the hallway, members of the mob effectively had the floor of the House of Representatives surrounded, controlling doors to the chamber's 2 major exits. All that stood between these members and the tip of a violent mob that had fought and intimidated its way to the floor of the House of Representatives was a wood-framed glass door, a stack of furniture, and roughly a dozen law enforcement officers. In short, the violent mob had made it to these members' last line of defense.
That's why I'm saying we'll make a path, bro. Just let us make a path. Just let us make a path. For the whole country, I want you to go home. Go. Let's go. Take this shit.
As a member of the mob began climbing through the broken glass of one of the doors, an officer protecting these members pointed a gun at the person and fired. As the sound of a gunshot reverberated around the Capitol, the law enforcement officer who heard it reported it. Upon hearing these reports of gunfire, the law enforcement officers protecting trapped elected officials instructed them to take their pins identifying them as members of Congress off so they would make it harder for the mob to identify them.
Yeah. The fuck?
Take your pins off.
Pins off.
The mob did not make it to the House floor. While it did not claim control of the remaining portions of the Capitol, it did not easily give up control of the portions of the Capitol it captured. And rioters continued to try to overpower police lines throughout the building and advance further. As law enforcement reinforcements arrived, they had to painstakingly remove, on a room-by-room basis, the numerous members of the mob who remained, and they did not all go quietly. This was a process that took hours, and while these hours unfolded, numerous congressional staffers and members of the press remained hidden in rooms and offices in which they had locked themselves for protection, not knowing during their waits, which must have felt like they lasted eternities, whether a member of the mob would find them and harm them. There was one part of the Capitol that the mob notably failed to breach, an area that was dubbed the Lower West Tunnel. If you've watched a presidential inauguration, you will immediately recognize this part of the Capitol and inauguration stage. This is what the area looks like on a typical inauguration day. By tradition, the president-elect and other government officials gather in the crypt of the Capitol and then walk down a set of stairs to the temporary inauguration stage. It is literally the path one walks to the peaceful transfer of power. This is what the path looked like on January 6, 2021. As the mob began surging to the door leading up to the crypt, one of the Metropolitan Police Department reinforcement units prepared to defend the tunnel. It was an elite unit that had experience with civil disorder. The battle cry from their commander was quite clear.
He's got a weapon in his hand, okay?
We are not losing the Capitol today. Some of the bloodiest fighting of the day occurred in this tunnel. An officer was crushed in a door within the hallway. Numerous members of the mob used spray against the officers. The mob threw makeshift weapons at the officers. Others hit officers with weapons that they carried. And one member of the mob even set off a firework. Tragically, a member of the mob died as the mob tried to press its way into the tunnel, and an officer was dragged out into the crowd and beaten. Notably, he was one of at least 6 officers who were dragged into the crowd and beaten during the course of the day's events. The tunnel, the pathway to the peaceful transition of power, held that day. It was not breached. Many of the rioters were proud to discuss the crimes they committed on January 6, 2021. After taking part in the siege of the Capitol, they shared messages with their friends and on social media, bragging about how they stormed the Capitol and forced our way into the Senate and House and muscled the cops back like Spartans. Stuart Rhodes, leader of the Oath Keepers, ominously warned, quote, "Patriots entering their own capital to send a message to the traitors is nothing compared to what's coming," unquote. A few days later, he added, quote, "If he's," in reference to President Trump, "not going to do the right thing and he's just going to let himself be removed illegally, then we should have brought rifles on January 6th. We could have fixed it right then and there. I'd hang fucking Pelosi from the lamppost." Indeed, in a number of cases we have tried, some of the most damning evidence has been the defendant's own words before, during, and after the events of January 6, 2021. The admissions after the fact are perhaps the most jarring. Having had time to reflect on their crimes that struck at our very democracy, the defendants expressed pride, not remorse. The attack is unlike anything we have ever seen. The Capitol was taken by force, and the government could not conduct business that was required by the Constitution to conduct. Members of Congress and their staff were forced to flee, and those who could not flee had to hide. Officers were assaulted on a scale we have never seen, and many of those officers continue to suffer from the injuries they sustained that day. There was a range of criminal conduct among those who were in the mob. At a high level, though, members of the mob who knowingly trespassed on the Capitol grounds can be divided into two categories: those who used violence and those who rode the coattails of others who used violence, using the access they were provided to commit their own crimes. As with all criminal matters, those charged with a crime are presumed innocent unless and until the government has proven their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This unprovoked and relentless attack overall has been proven in court again and again, in trial after trial, with evidence like the evidence I have shared with you today. The United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, along with many Department of Justice colleagues and law enforcement partners from around the country, have been working tirelessly to bring to justice individuals responsible for the siege of the Capitol. We have worked closely with law enforcement to review thousands upon thousands of hours of video and an enormous number of digital and social media to determine who committed these crimes and the appropriate charges to bring against each defendant charged. This process is arduous, painstaking, and thorough. It is also done appreciating that while the mission is important, protecting the rights of witnesses, victims, and defendants is paramount. The department's work is not to win at all costs. It is to do justice for all. That is why, for example, this prosecution also includes what is likely the most robust criminal discovery project in the department's history, showcasing the office's commitment to the constitutional precepts of fairness and integrity. And it is, of course, why the government will continue to bear the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for each defendant charged. No defendant can or will be convicted based on general evidence of what occurred on January 6, 2021. Instead, the government must identify evidence specific to the individual charged, establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that that individual committed crimes on January 6, 2021, exactly as the government has done in nearly 900 cases to date. These convictions include 149 people convicted of assaulting, resisting, or impeding officers or employees, and 41 of these individuals were convicted of using a deadly or dangerous weapon or causing bodily injury to an officer in connection with these assaults. There are still people who have not yet been held accountable for similar assaults. Many citizens from around the country have already come forward to identify individuals connected with the January 6 attacks. As a result of these tips, scores of individuals have been identified and will soon be prosecuted for violent acts at the Capitol and other violations of federal law. The public's help is still needed, though. More than 80 people are still wanted and unidentified for acts of violence at the Capitol. Today, we will post a list of individuals most wanted by the FBI for violence at the Capitol, calling for any help the public can provide in identifying them, including the following. The statute of limitations, that is the deadline by which we must bring charges, runs on January 5th, 2026, for these and the other yet-to-be-charged crimes that occurred on January 6th, 2021. In trial after trial, officers have recounted in chilling testimony the ferocity of the battle to hold the Capitol and the fear they felt they would never see their families again. The thousands of employees who work in the Capitol experienced the same terror. Not just the politicians, but the thousands of staffers just trying to serve their country. These public servants have described fleeing for their lives and cowering in hiding spaces to avoid the furor of the mob. Some have left their job out of fear of being attacked again. Those involved in the siege of the Capitol descended upon Washington, D.C. from nearly every state in our union. It cannot be emphasized enough that had their plans succeeded, our system of government, grounded in democratic ideals and the rule of law, would have been in peril. I want to take you back to the Capitol Rotunda and how it looked on January 6, 2021. If you can take your eyes off the chaos that's occurring on the floor, you'll notice that the rotunda is lined with portraits, and that there's a portrait on the far right of the screen that's cut off. Here is a close-up of that portrait. It is a portrait of General Washington, who had just led an army that was undyingly loyal to him, resigning his military commission and giving up control of the military, not using it to install himself as the leader of the country whose independence he had just won. Instead, he submitted to the democratic process. He was twice elected president of our new nation. After serving 2 terms as president, he voluntarily relinquished control again, even though many of his fellow Americans would have been happy to have him serve as president for life, a de facto monarch. There was no precedent prior to this moment for the voluntary relinquishment of such power. As he handed over the reins to his successor, John Adams, the American experiment began in earnest. We cannot replace votes and deliberation with violence and intimidation. Our great democratic experiment requires nurturing and a shared sense of the importance of protecting its continued existence through both laws and norms. Without a shared commitment to the rule of law, our future remains in question. We have seen that shared commitment, though, in our prosecutions, where countless fellow citizens have prioritized our country over relationships with coworkers, family, and friends, doing their part to hold those who committed crimes on January 6th accountable for their conduct. And we continue to call upon our fellow Americans to provide the invaluable assistance that they have been providing in connection with this prosecution. Thank you very much for attending today.
Can you tell us why you did this today?